I just feel as Martin is preaching, teaching, sharing his heart, it's really good to listen, but it's good to participate. You know, we don't want to be speaking at you, but we're speaking with you. So we're just going to pray for Mark. Yeah, Father, we thank you for Martin. Father, I pray that you just move through him. Give him the right words, Father. Father, I pray that as he shares this morning, it will just bring exactly what someone needs to hear, what we need to hear, Father. May we see your heart in what he shares. May we get to know you more through what Martin shares. We thank you for Martin. We thank you for his heart, Lord Jesus. And we just give this time over to you. Amen.
Amen. We'll no doubt have an opportunity to worship in a moment again, to pick up some of what has already been shared, some of the encouragements, just to make you laugh a little bit. When I did speak to Riley about running across the stage like that, it's funny when you look at perspectives on a situation. He had a very different perspective on that situation than I did. His answer to me was, I'm too fast for Daddy, Daddy can't catch me. And he was wanting to do it again just to prove how fast he is. So it's funny when you look at two different perspectives of the same situation. But those of you that were here last week might remember that Richard came to speak to us about this idea of building church, and a particular interaction between Jesus and a guy called Peter, where he says, on this rock I will build my church, when Peter has this declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. It's quite an amazing thing, but it highlighted to me one story that comes straight after that I wanted to talk with you today. And Richard did mention it. And it was from Matthew 17, verses 24 to 27. And it's this very peculiar situation, a very odd exchange, but one that I think we could draw a lot of richness from that can help us as we seek to live out our discipleship journeys together. So let me just read it with you. If you have got Bibles, it's Matthew 17, verses 24 to 27, or if you don't, it's on the screen. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he said. He replied. When Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. "What do you think, Simon?" he asked. "From who do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes from? Their own children or from others?" "From others," Peter answered. "Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and for yours." It's a very funny situation, and Jesus, to be honest, encountered situations like this all the time, didn't he? Where people would question his behavior. They would question, "Or doesn't your teacher do this?" They were trying to pull him up all the time on the way that he was behaving, because what he was doing and the culture he was sowing was so contrary to what the Jewish culture was at the time. And just if you're not really sure what the temple tax was, essentially this wasn't a tithe, it wasn't a love gift, it wasn't a donation, it was something imposed on people essentially just to keep the temple operating. It was a tax everybody paid. And the people are asking Peter in this situation, "Well, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" as if to trip him up. He says, "Yes, he does." But Jesus has some incredibly important things to teach us through this encounter. First of all, what we know about this is it was a teaching moment. Jesus behaves like a classic teacher. When they all arrive back at the house, when it says this in verse 25, when Peter came back into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. He asked Peter a question to help Peter figure something out. He says to him, "What do you think?" kind of like when you've ever been in school or you're being taught something and someone's trying to be a really kind and loving teacher to you. They go, and so what do you think about that one? I try and do this with Riley all the time. Doesn't work, as you can tell. So Riley, why don't we run on the stage? Because I'm faster than you. So, again. But it's a teaching moment for Jesus. It's a teaching moment for Jesus. And actually, fundamentally for me, I think this passage links us back to something that Jesus prays a few nights before he's crucified. This idea, and we use it quite a lot in our church culture, and really when it talks about us being in the world, but not of it. A dilemma that I think all of us face when we try and navigate our discipleship journey. What does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to be the people of God in a world that is very much different and contrary to the way that God's asked me to live? It has very different values than God's asked me to have. It's had very different priorities than God's asked me to have. And how do we do that? And for this, it's about the temple tax, but I think there's things for us to pull out of it. So I want to read with you from John 17, because I think it's quite a special moment. I love this bit, because Jesus prays for quite a number of different things before he's taken up before he gets crucified. And he has this to say in verse 14. I've given them your world, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. You see, there's this encounter with Peter and this person questioning about the temple tax. And Jesus has a remarkable thing to talk about. He teaches them this lesson where he says, like, in theory, right, we're faced with an earthly issue here. He's saying, well, actually, as a child of the king, as a son or a daughter of the king, are you exempt from it? Well, yes. But as to not cause offense, Jesus sorts a situation out for Peter to be able to pay for that. So as to not cause offense, this balance of, we've got this spiritual dilemma, this dilemma on our hands, but we've got to somehow respond to the situation the world's facing us. You see, and Jesus is saying here that we are in the world, but we do not come from it. We are not of the world. But I think one thing to clarify is that we are sent to it. There's a real strong emphasis. Just as Christ was sent to the world, he sends us into the world. He's not asking us to remove ourselves from society and become like a nun or a monk and live a lifestyle hidden away from everybody like a hermit. In fact, we are sent into the world. You may like to think of it that we're good news people for a bad news world. If you ever look at the news, it's terrible. It's bleak. There just seems to be a lot of negativity, a lot of bad stuff going around. Yet we have this gospel with the good news. That's hope for all mankind. But again, we're still faced with that challenge, aren't we? How do we live in a world where how we're asked to conduct ourselves and how we're asked to behave and the kingdom we're asked to establish is so much different than the world around us? And to be honest, this is probably the hardest challenge I've faced in my discipleship journey. There's a lot of other little smaller issues that I've had to try and work through. But at its core, the day-to-day issue I face is, how do I be a Christian in a world that isn't? How can I live as a disciple in a world that doesn't want me to? Or that makes it incredibly difficult for me to do that properly. I had a friend who I knew really well. He used to be a Muslim. So he was from Jordan. And he had a crazy conversion experience in his life. I don't talk to him very much anymore, but the 6 months that I spent with him was quite significant because I learned a lot about him. But he often found himself talking about Allah when he would pray. And I would go to him and be like, look, mate, it's not Allah. But for him, there was this cultural pull that he was culturally Muslim his whole life. Everything he did was culturally Muslim. And he had this transformation experience where he accepted Jesus as Lord into his life. But there was things that he had to change and that were incredibly difficult for him to change or look at. Now, obviously, Allah is Arabic for God, so there are bigger problems to have in your life. But for my head, I was thinking as a Westerner, Allah is the Muslim God. It's the Islamic God. It's not my God. And we would have this discussion quite a lot, and it gave me a lot of understanding about where he comes from, his culture. Well, what I learned very, very quickly was that the culture that he lived in had a huge impact on everything he did. It impacted every area of his life. Everything. And that culture was deeply rooted in Islam for him. But we too face a culture we have within the UK. There's a culture that is changing. It's morphing into a lot of different things, and it's different than it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Those of you that are blessed enough to know what that was like 30 years ago. But the culture is forever changing. Yet the culture, the kingdom of God that we've been asked and sent to establish here on earth has never changed. It's the same as what Christ has asked us to do 2,000 years ago when he had this interaction with Peter. And it's hard. But one encouragement we can see straight from the beginning of this passage is that, and I love this because the passage that Richard looked at last week was talking about how he was called Simon. And you might see him referred to as Simon and Peter. In fact, in this passage, we see him referred to as both. But he was called Peter because of this amazing declaration of faith he had and said, Peter, on this rock I will build my church. Your name will be Peter. But we see here Jesus calling him Simon. Why? I've always found that fascinating. So Jesus is calling him Simon, but when we hear Matthew, who's the writer of this gospel, talk about him, he calls him Peter. It's kind of confusing. You think, is he talking about two different people here, or is he talking about the same person? But I think he's talking about one single person at two different stages on their journey. See, for me, this is an encouragement, a subtle detail like this, because it says we're all on a journey. Simon hadn't yet fully embraced what it means to be Peter, because if you read later on, he's called Peter all the time. And Matthew was certainly seeing him as Peter, the rock on which Christ would build his church, but Jesus was talking to him as Simon. He was going through a process of becoming who God needed him to be. And we all are going through a process of becoming who God needs us to be. And it will take a lifetime to get there. But it's an encouragement to all of us that this whole journey of what it means to be in the world but not of it is a journey we all go through. It isn't a switch we flick on and we think, fine, I'm a Christian now, suddenly I'm going to think differently. No, it's a challenge. We have to sometimes wrestle with these things. But even if we look at two areas of our lives, what we're called to do as a Christian is prayer is a huge part of what it means to be a Christian. It's what fuels our relationship with God as we talk to him and communicate with him. And I find a lot of the time that although Philippians 6, Paul says to us, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Essentially, in all areas, whether you're worried or not, pray. The world around me says something different to me. Do. As a man, when I face a problem in my life, prayer isn't the first thing I go to. You might be shocked to hear. Sometimes the first thing I want to do is try and fix the situation, work harder, work smarter, try and do more. When I'm anxious, I try and do more to fix the situation. That's what the culture is telling me to do. That's what the world around me is telling me to do. Yet we're encouraged time and time and time again to do. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, pray. When we look at money, the Bible talks a lot about money. Acts 20, verse 35 says, it's more blessed to give than to receive. Luke 6 talks about give and it will be given to you. But when I look at the world, it tells me to save, to hoard, to be greedy, to want more. And these are the challenges, very few challenges, and I'm sure we all have specific challenges that we face. But when we're called to be in the world, but not of it, to be sent into the world, to be this good news people for a bad news world, we need to have a perspective on what it means. You see, for Simon Peter in this situation, one thing I find amazing is that God sends him. Jesus sends him to do something. He's faced with a dilemma in his life where this idea of being in the world but not of it, I've got to pay this temple tax, I don't want to cause offense. Jesus was very explicit about that. I think he was more concerned with winning hearts than offending hearts in this situation. There are other situations in the Gospels where we see that actually embracing the truth of the gospel was more important than the offense it might cause. But in this situation, Jesus is like, it's not going to cause any harm or damage. We don't want to cause offense. But I'm going to come up with a spiritual, a supernatural solution to your problem. But you see, Peter was a fisherman. And what was he sent to do to solve this problem? Fish. But so that you may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch out of its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and for yours. Jesus didn't ask him to do something that was different than his everyday. He was asked to be a fisherman, and he was sent to fish. But God turned that around to be a really fruitful, amazing miracle, really. See, being in the world but not of it doesn't mean that we become a monk, like I said. It doesn't mean that we hide away, but it means that we're sent. And the reality is God might have sent you into the jobs that you've got, into the situation you've got. And that's exactly where he needs you to be. He can use your earthly skills, your gifts, your talents that he's given you, whether that be whatever your profession might be, whether you're a mum, whether you're retired, whatever stage of life you're in, whether you're in a place of in-between at the moment, he's given you gifts and talents that he wants to use. And here we see Peter being sent to fish to solve a problem. He was probably thinking, I fish all the time. Can't you just give me the money? Can't we pull it out another way? But I think it's significant that Jesus asked him to go do what his earthly gift and talent was. And I think it teaches us something too. And I think also there's a recognition in all of this when we try and wrestle with this idea of being in the world but not of it, is to understand who our boss is. Who's in charge? When I go in to do a lot of work in some rentals for landlords, and often whenever I go in there, I get encountering the tenants who have a longer list than the landlord of the things that need to be repaired. And they're often very different. So I go in there, I've been sent by the landlord to go do a job, and I have a list of things I've got to go do, and I'm cracking on with that, and while I'm doing it, the tenants are like, oh, while you're here, this is broken, that's broken, this is broken, can you replace this? And I'm obviously as nice as I possibly can be. I try and help them out where I can be. I go above and beyond where I am able to. But at the end of the day, I have to remember who sent me. And I have to remind them, I was sent here by the landlord. If you have a problem, I can relay this back to them. But ultimately, they're the one paying me to be here. They're the one asking me to do this job. And so, whose rule and authority do I follow in that specific situation in a work sense? It's not the tenant, it's the landlord. And I know that sounds like a crazy example, but it shows us something about what the rule of authority is like in our lives and what Jesus' rule and authority should be like. Peter had an obedience to Jesus in this when he was asked to go do something. Didn't question it. We don't hear any response. There might have been a bit of an exchange with Peter going, which lake? Is there only one fish with a coin in its mouth and I've got to try and find the right lake? Which part of the lake shall I fish on? These are the questions I would have asked. What length of line do you want me to use? What kind of size fish are we talking about? But he has obedience. He goes and does it. Jesus says, right, so that we don't cause offense, go and do this. He submitted to the rule and authority of Christ in that situation. And we see God provide for him in an incredible way, using the gifts and talents that he was given. So when we look at us being disciples, living in the world that we're living, what does that mean for us? How do we be in the world but not of it? But we have to have this mentality of being sent. But we're sent by God into the workplaces. That changes the way that we operate. It should change the way that we think, because suddenly now what we're going to be doing is we're going to asking God, when we go to work in the morning, God, how do you want to use me today? What do you want me to do? And I can promise you, God isn't going to ask you to go in there and turn tables upside down every day. In this situation, he says to Peter, we don't want to cause offense. We want to win hearts in this situation. And that's more important than us having to pay some money. There may be other situations you face in your life as a disciple where the truth and your conviction to Christ is questioned. And holding on to your convictions will cause offense. And that's really hard. But I think in those moments, this is where we need to cling to Christ more and more and more. He's in charge. He sent you. Wherever you're going, whatever you're doing in your week, he sent you there. Whether it's a hard situation or an easy one, we need to ask God for his help. When we look at this situation too, we see that it's a response to something. We always like to look at that verse where we are always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have, where Paul gives us that kind of encouragement. Always be prepared. Now, we often think of that as the gospel, don't we? We think of that, well, I've always got to be prepared to give a reason for the hope that I have, the reason that Christ has changed my life. But sometimes it's being prepared to give a reason, like Peter did in this situation. Does your teacher pay the temple tax? Well, yes, he does, actually. Yes, he does. We need to be on our guard if we're to be sent into this world, to be a blessing, to be good news people in a bad news world. We need to be prepared that we need to be able to respond to situations. The armor of God, when Paul talks about this in Ephesians 6, he says at the end, and pray on all occasions. I take great encouragement in that. With all kinds of requests, just pray. See, I sometimes tell myself, and sometimes we might tell ourselves because of the culture of church we're in, that prayer is about a relationship with God. You're asking God for too much. Every time you pray, you're just saying, please, please help me, help me, help me. And then sometimes that can put you off praying because you think, I shouldn't be praying like that. So what you try and do is you try not to pray like that. And then what happens is you don't pray at all. I've been there. I think, I'm praying wrong. But when we're taught about this armor of God, putting on these things and walking in faith, pray with all kinds of petitions, all kinds of requests. Just whatever you do, just keep praying. I think that's one of the amazing things that we can do to help keep us having this perspective of being sent to the world but not being of it, is to just keep praying. We need to ask God for his help, for his guidance. Like I said, when you go to work, if you have the attitude of someone being sent rather than being of there, you're going to ask God more and more, well, how do you want to use me today? What do you want me to do? One of the amazing things that I think about this story isn't anything to do with the temple tax, really. It isn't really anything to do with the fact that Peter was fishing or was managed to catch a fish with a coin in its mouth, which is pretty impressive. That is one party trick. But it's this last line. It says, take it and give it to them for my tax and for yours. Take it, and it will pay for my tax and for yours. We had no example here of Peter ever having struggled to pay for the temple tax. But we see an example where Jesus has gone before him in this situation, and he's provided for him. Not only for Jesus to find a solution to this problem, but he's provided for Peter too. He said there will be enough in that solution to meet your needs. But if we go back to the fact that Peter was asked to use a line, you see, Peter, in every other scenario, was using a net as a fisherman. Yet in this scenario, he was asked to use a line to catch one fish rather than many. This was clearly something that took a little bit more skill, perhaps, a little bit more patience sometimes. And I think sometimes we lose that in our Christian journeys, this idea of patience. Sometimes we've got God to fix everything immediately for us, and I certainly do sometimes. In fact, 95% of the time it would be a lot easier if that happened. But there was something about Jesus saying being specific, quality over quantity. Jesus had gone before him and provided a solution to this dilemma. And not only was that solution enough for Peter, but it was enough for Jesus and for Peter's temple tax. And that's really what the gospel's about. It's about abundance. It's an amazing image where Jesus goes before us, and not only does he pay for one person's wrongdoings and sin in their lives, but he pays for all of ours, all of creation. There's an abundance of provision. And I think when we live as people that are sent to the world and not of the world, but we're living in the world, and we're praying and seeking God to use us, we'll begin to see him do more and more and more. We'll begin to see some of that abundance, some of that miracle in the everyday. Jesus could have just said, look, mate, here we go, pay for the temple tax and be on your way. But he chooses to use this crazy miracle to provide a solution to it. And it should be an encouragement to us that God can do amazing things in the everyday in us. In the everyday, mundane things we have to do. God can do incredible things. But I guess it's about our readiness, our ability to respond, putting on that armor of God, praying without ceasing. 1 Corinthians 16 verse 13 says, be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be courageous, be strong, do everything in love. It's not about us being a bulldozer, starting fights, picking arguments with people. This is about us carrying love with us everywhere we go. We're good news people in a bad news world. That doesn't mean we need to be bad news to people every time we turn up. We're called to be good news and do things in love. But you see, our loyalty comes to Christ first in our lives. And because of who he is and the kind of culture he is trying to establish in the kingdom he is trying to build, he will always call us to be a blessing to those around us, to love our enemy, to go the extra mile for people. And that's something we just need to pray for God's help with. I guess really the crux of it is, if we are to be in the world but not of it, we need to have a perspective of us being sent into the world. And that takes time. Peter was on a journey here. It's kind of like he gets a lot of condensed attention from Jesus in this gospel over a few chapters where Jesus is continually teaching him lots and lots of different things. But we need to pray for God's help and guidance. We need to pray for his help. We need to ask him to reassure us, to remind us. We need to start our day with an attitude of asking God, look, what do you want to do? How do you want to use me today? So I'm going to invite the band up. Great. There you are. They run away. We're just going to pray. And I wonder if, just as the band are getting ready, if you'd like to close your eyes, and if you want to respond to this idea of being sent into the world, then just raise your hand. No one else is going to see. But it's an idea of you saying to God, you know what? Just like Jenny's encouragement to all of us, that significance of raising your hand. Raise your hand in significance, whatever stage of life you're in.